Configuring VM replication in Hyper-V 2016. In previous videos, we have configured failover clustering, and failover clustering is a good feature. It provides automatic load balancing for VMs as well as it does provide high availability. Apart from this, there is a feature called Hyper-V replication that allows you to replicate virtual machines or VMs from one Hyper-V host to another. Let's say, take an example of production site and DR site. In production site, you may have some critical VMs that you would like to replicate to your disaster recovery site so that in case if disaster strikes, you can start those VMs which were replicated from production to DR on DR Hyper-V server. So I have now another Hyper-V host called Hyper4. This server Hyper4 is not part of cluster or failover cluster. And I am assuming that this Hyper4, let's say, is a Hyper-V server that exists in DR site. So what I would like to demonstrate that I will configure Hyper-V replication between, for example, let's say one of the Hyper-V nodes, which is part of my cluster called Hypercluster 1, and Hyper4, so that VM will be replicated from Hyper 1 to Hyper 4. And I'm assuming that Hyper 4 is the server in DR. Uh, I'm consider a scenario that you have a dedicated fiber connection between two sites. So you are stretching your subnet. So I don't have a different subnet though, but it can be configured between multiple or different subnets. That's not a problem here. Uh, the idea here is to demonstrate the feature of Hyper-V replication. So what I will do first, I go back to my failover cluster manager, right? And we have three nodes, right? Hyper 1, Hyper 2, and Hyper 3, as you may know. And just to know that if I go to, yeah, sorry. If I go to Hyper-V Manager, right? And in Hyper 1, if I check the Hyper-V settings, there is something called replication configuration. And if you notice, this replication configuration option is grayed out, that I can't enable this replication enable configuration, right? And the reason of this is this. If you see down there, this server is a part of failover cluster. So I have to use failover cluster manager to change replication settings. Same thing if I go to Hyper 2 and go to Hyper-V settings, I will see the same thing because Hyper 2 is also part of failover cluster. And if I go to Hyper 3, it will also be the same because Hyper 1, Hyper 2, and Hyper 3, they are part of failover cluster, right? However, Hyper 4 is not a part of failover cluster. It's a hypervisor running in DR site. So it's a standalone Hyper-V server. It's in a part of a domain, but it's not a part of failover cluster called hypercluster 1. So if I go to Hyper-V settings here, I will be able to enable replication using Hyper-V Manager. So what I'm gonna do, I just enable the server as replica server and type of authentication, I would say Kerberos HTTP and specify the servers that are allowed to replicate virtual machine to this computer. I have two options. We can say allow replication from any authenticated server or allow replication from specified server. Or when I say specified server, then I can specify the name of a server. If I want to specify every servers or all, I can specify a wildcard as well, as they say, star. So for example, all Hyper-V server from itsense.com. So I can say star.itsense.com. So, okay, I would like to configure it from any authenticated server, and that's okay for me. And give me an option that I have to make sure that the firewall is allowing this. So I have to make sure that port 80 is enabled in the firewall if firewall is enabled, and enable Hyper-V replica listener rule in firewall. I think in my case, firewall is disabled because it's a part of my company-wide IT sense group policy. Uh, yeah, it's on for just public network. Okay. So we have configured Hyper-V replication on Hyper 4 as it was a standalone Hyper-V host. But on failover clustering, if you have a Hyper-V which are part of failover cluster, that we need to configure Hyper-V replica broker. And from where I can configure Hyper-V replica broker. If you notice that if I go to nodes and Hyper 1, or select Hyper 1, Hyper 2, or Hyper 3, there is no replication options. If I go to roles and select, for example, a VM server 1, that let's say this is the VM I want to replicate, I have a replication option, and if I try to enable the replication, it will say you have to configure a server to allow replication from this computer. Then you have to make sure that you have enabled the replication. And here, that if the replica server is on a failover cluster, you need to specify the name of Hyper-V replica broker. And this information I will find in failover cluster manager, right? So where is it? Where I will find this? Okay, for that, I think the first thing that you need to do, you go to configure role, next, and then you have something called Hyper-V replica broker. And what Hyper-V replica broker does, Hyper-V replica broker enables the failover cluster to participate in VM replication with Hyper-V replica. Only one Hyper-V replica broker can be configured on each failover cluster. So next, type the name that the client will be using to accessing this clustered role. So I would say HV broker. Okay, HV broker, or let's say Hyper-V broker, and let's say 192.168.203. Oh, sorry. 103.211. Okay. All right. And Hyper-V broker, it's here. Okay. And the owner is Hyper. So once after configuring Hyper-V broker role, which is running on Hyper 1, it's time to configure a replication. So I select server 1, replication, enable replication. Next, replica server. I will say hyper4.itsense.com. Okay, what type of authentication? I will choose Kerberos HTTP. And yes, I would like to replicate this disk. 5-minute frequency. I will maintain only the latest recovery points. By default, it creates every recovery point every hour, and it is configured to keep 24 recovery points, one for every hour in a day. I'm okay with the latest recovery point. And this is the size of initial copy, which is 8.47. And I have option to to seed that I can send the initial copy over the network or by external media, or I can use an existing VM on the replica server as an initial copy. Now I would like to send it over the network, and I would like to start the replication immediately. Next, and say finish. Let's see what happens. And it's configured. Okay, now if we go to Hyper4 and go to Hyper-V Manager, you will see server 1, and it's receiving changes, and right now it's 12%. So what's happening is basically that this VM is getting replicated from failover cluster hypercluster 1 to this Hyper-V host called Hyper4. Keep this in mind, this server Hyper4 is not part of failover cluster. It's a standalone Hyper-V host, which also tells us that we don't have to have cluster on both end to configure the replication. You can configure Hyper-V replication between two standalone hosts, or between failover cluster and standalone hosts, or between two failover clusters as well. If, again, most important point, that if you have some servers which are part of failover clusters, I mean Hyper-V servers, and which are part of failover clusters, then you need to configure Hyper-V replication broker role, and that's basically just a role that moves to one of the server, which I have just demonstrated to you that how to do that. So suppose if I have a VM here called server 5 and I want to replicate to failover cluster, under the replica server I will select the Hyper-V replication broker. So it's replicating now. So what I will do, I will pause this video and I will be back when it's done. All right, and replication has completed. And as you can see on Hyper 4, server 1 is there and the status off. And if I go to this status here, down there, you see under the replication tab, replication mode is a replica, replication is enabled, replication health is normal, primary server is hyper 2, and replica server is hyper full. So replication is happening. And as you can see, if I go replication, there is an option test failover, paused replication, failover, which will do failover in reality, view replication health, which will provide the status of replication. At the moment, it's all healthy. And remove replication, of course, remove. So how about if I say test failover? So how it will test it? It will create a brand new virtual machine. It will not touch this one. It will create a new virtual machine based on the recovery point, which is this one. And this recovery point is the recovery point of server 1. So based on server 1 recovery point, it will create another test VM. And that VM can, we can test failover using that that newly created VM that will be created based on the recovery point. So yeah, and again it will take a while. And here, server 1, and if I say connect and power on, as you can see, the network adapter is not connected. So because we are testing the failover, it, or it did not connect the network card. So we can just test the failover. If the virtual machine comes back online and we can see everything is good, it means yes, our VM is replicating very well. Um, and it's great, but it doesn't have any network. So it's like it's in its own bubble. So as you can see, this is a replica of server 1. And we are testing failover at the moment. And how we are testing it, that Hyper-V, destination Hyper-V, which is Hyper 4, has created uh, a copy of that VM based on the recovery point. So this is server 1, all good, great, perfect. You see, is stop test failover. If I say stop test failover, yes, then it will delete this test VM and its data will be discarded. It's gone. Merge in progress, all good. Super simple and smooth and easy and excellent feature without any extra licensing or any extra hurdle. So this is it, guys. That's how you configure Hyper-V replication and you perform failover. Failback is the manual thing. I mean, let's say once you have to recover from your disaster, then what you will do, you will set up a replication again. Once you recreate your production environment, you replicate from DR to production, and then you start those VM. Then you fail over to your production environment. I hope I'm making sense, but anyone with a concept of production and DR must be able to, understand this very easily. So this is it, guys. Thank you so much for watching, and please do subscribe and take it easy.